Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Hathcock, and with this lecture, we'll be looking at the formation of what's called the New South and the rise of an organization called the NAACP. All right, so looking at the South after Reconstruction, you go through this period where primarily African American civil rights were being denied. The right to vote was being taken away. Basic civil rights were being taken away. A lot of that has to do with racism in the way that this society is going to sort of form in the years after the Civil War. Now, one group that had a lot to do with the rise of this New South, or these ideas coming after the Civil War, is the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or the UDC. The UDC was big on sort of glorifying the past, arguing that the South had a right to secede from the Union. Slavery was not as evil as people make it out to be, that it was kind of a benevolent institution that actually took care of African Americans, just basic lies like that. UDC wasn't alone in promoting those ideas, but collectively those ideas are referred to as the lost cause. The lost cause is this myth, this idea that the South was perfect, slavery was a good institution, the South was right to secede, and really their only regret is that they lost the Civil War. They have no regrets about the institution of slavery. They have no regrets about waging civil war. Lost cause just simply argues that that way of life that had been the old South, it's lost, and they want to try to bring it back, as much of it back as they possibly can. You see this lost cause coming through in several ways. One is the UDC did a lot to pay authors. They would, as an organization, they would collect money to give to authors who wrote about the lost cause, who sort of glorified slavery in the past. To be in the United Daughters of the Confederacy, you had to be rich, you had to be white, you had to prove that your family somehow, some way helped the Confederacy during the Civil War. That's just to get in the door of being a part of the UDC. And then once you were a member of the UDC, you were very active in promoting lost cause ideology. You would sort of clean up cemeteries where Confederate soldiers were buried, put up signs, flowers, sort of make them, a little bit more of a beautiful place to try to visit. They would campaign real hard for national days like a Robert E. Lee Day, just to sort of, pay tribute to him and remember him and things like that. You can see this big statue here on a town square, the left-hand side picture. Growing up in McKinney, Texas, I can remember there was a statue similar to that. Wasn't nearly as big as that one, but we had a statue erected to the Confederate dead. Here where I live now in Denton, Texas, we had a UDC statue on the town square. It's been removed, but it was erected in honor of the Confederate dead. I've visited several town squares throughout Texas, and you can find them. You can find them in Georgia, Tennessee, all across the South. And really, what those statues are more than anything is it's a conversation starter. You think about town squares and what they were before cars and highways. It was the epicenter of life in a city. So you might have a mom taking her kid to do some shopping on the downtown square, and little kid says, "Hey, mommy, what's that statue?" And that's a chance for that mom to say, "Well, Johnny, that's in honor of the Confederate dead. Your grandfather fought for the Confederacy. Our family used to own slaves, and we were good to our slaves. Then the Yankees came through here, tore everything up, and our family's never been the same since." So it's kind of a way just to start that story, to tell that lost cause ideology that slavery was not bad. The only regret they have is having lost the Civil War and things like that. But the greatest commercial the Lost Cause ever got was Margaret Mitchell's novel Gone with the Wind. They got turned into a 1939 blockbuster movie. It's a decent movie. It's long. You've got to be committed if you're going to watch the thing. But yeah, this was a huge movie for its time in 1939, but would continue to be sort of like, for many Americans, this was the South. This is what slavery was like. In the movie, you had the character Mammy that you can see here. She and Scarlett are almost like family. It's a playful relationship. It's not really one of I don't know, physical abuse or any type of evil things happening. Uh, Gone with the Wind shows the slaves being treated in a very humane sort of a way. But I promise you, if you study the institution of slavery, you'll find that it was dehumanizing, it was brutal, it was evil. There really wasn't anything kind about it. And I promise you, when freedom came, the slaves were more than happy to be freed. They rejoiced in their freedom. And they weren't really like, I don't know, they weren't feeling a sense of sadness that slavery was gone, right? That they were no longer in that family, if you will. So, yeah, the greatest commercial the Lost Cause ever got was Gone with the Wind. Okay, but there was a desire for a new South coming out of the Civil War. There were many Southerners who said, hey, look, you know what? We lost the war. Slavery is gone. So let's deal with the realities of our world. And instead of sort of, I don't know, crying about the past, let's look to the future. And the desire for a new South involved things like education. People who argued for changing the South said we need public schools. We need to educate children going forward. It also called for industrialization in the South, building of factories and things like that. They wanted railroads to come through the South. They basically just wanted a whole change in the way society was ran down in the southern states. So there was that desire for schools, industry, education, banks, right, financial institutions, and things like that. The political reality, though, of that time was that a lot of that stuff I'm talking about really is Republican ideology. It was a Republican Party at that time that was pushing for industry, railroads, banks, public schools, and the Democratic Party at that point in time really wasn't interested in those things. Political reality is that the Democrats controlled the South, especially after the redemption, post Reconstruction phase. And if they start pushing for things like factories, schools, everybody wanted the railroads because that brought with it some wealth. But if they started sort of pushing these Republican ideals, people might actually start voting Republican along the way. So the reality of that time was the Democratic Party was firmly in control of the South, and they just weren't going to push really hard for things like schools and factories, things of that ilk. Here's another reality too, though, a problem for those who wanted to modernize the South. Most of America's major financial banks were in the Northeast, and they really weren't that interested at that time in investing in anything down in the South. So that's a reality as well. It was just getting capital, it was just getting the money that it would take to make these changes to the South. Well, another reality of that age that started in the South but very quickly spread to the North as well is the emergence of Jim Crow society or Jim Crow laws. Now, Jim Crow, I guess first let's explain how it got the name. There was an old play from the 1830s called Jim Crow. In these sort of Jim Crow minstrels, musicals, white actors would put on blackface and carry out all manner of stereotypes about African Americans. These stereotypes were supposed to be comedies. These were plays that people would pay money to and they would go and laugh. So they're extremely racist. These old Jim Crow musicals, these plays from back in the 1830s. Excuse me. So that's where the name comes from. Jim Crow laws, segregation laws really started in Mississippi, but then they spread throughout other parts of the South. And before you knew it, the North was embracing Jim Crow ideology as well. Well, Jim Crow is really about two things. I've always tried to explain that to students. It's a double-edged sword. Number one, Jim Crow is about disfranchisement. It's about taking away somebody's right to vote. So you see here, disfranchisement is one part of Jim Crow. The other part of Jim Crow is racial segregation, and that'll come through in the Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson. But let's stick with disfranchisement now. Let's explain that, and then we'll look at segregation. There were lots of different disfranchisement laws. It just depended on what state you lived in at the time. I'm just going to talk about a few of them, but understand that there were a lot of disfranchisement laws. It really depended on the area in which you lived. Now, disfranchisement in taking away the right to vote. You might recall that there had been a 15th Amendment to the Constitution, and it said that you could not deny someone the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So you can't get around that. That's something legal. That's federal government. That's the Constitution. You cannot deny someone the right to vote based on the color of their skin. So Jim Crow is how the South will get around the 15th Amendment. It's how they will find ways to disfranchise people, but not because of the color of their skin. Let's see, one disfranchisement law was the property qualification. Some states said that you had to own so much land in order to be able to vote. You might recall we talked about sharecrop farming, how a lot of the former slaves became sharecrop farmers. And in that scenario, you're working that land, but you don't technically own that land that you're working, right? It's a contract that you sign with the owner of the land to work it. So sharecrop farmers did not own the land that they worked, so that disqualifies sharecrop farmers not having property, not owning a certain acreage of land. Let's see, there was also a literacy test. They would pass a copy of the Constitution across the table to somebody and say, okay, so read Article 1, Section 8. And God bless them, a lot of these sharecrop farmers of the South, they couldn't write their own name, much less read something on paper. And again, God bless them, they haven't had an education. There's no public schools at that time. So, you know, if you couldn't read and write, you couldn't do a literacy test, you couldn't vote. You know, also, like, it was up to the guy running the poll, the voting booth, as to whether or not you could cast that vote. Let's say that you had a PhD from Harvard University in political science, and they slide that piece of paper across to you and say, read Article 1, Section 8. Not only could you read Article 1, Section 8, you could probably explain it to this person better than they understand it to begin with. But so it wasn't enough just to read it, you also had to explain it. And that person in the poll booth could say, well, you know what, you just didn't explain it to my satisfaction. Never mind that you, like, again, have a PhD from Harvard and you can explain this thing forward, left, right, back. You just didn't satisfy the guy who was running the booth. So the literacy test was another way that you could keep people from voting. The poll tax is something that was heavily used. State of Texas used the poll tax. Poll tax is just a tax that people paid, kind of like a head tax, like just counting heads. There's this many people. So a poll tax or a head tax was something that was assessed. And in a lot of states, in order to vote, you had to have proof that you'd paid your poll tax. And I mean, the poll tax wasn't too heavy. It just depended on the place and time. It was like, I don't know, a couple of dollars, maybe $5 at its height. But when you're a dirt poor sharecrop farmer and you're indebted up to your eyeballs, $2, $3, $4, $5 is a lot for somebody who's just busted and dead broke. So a lot of them didn't pay their poll taxes. And even in cases where maybe they did pay their poll taxes, they still had to hold on to the receipt. And oftentimes the receipt would get misplaced, lost. You'd show up to the voting booth and, you know, somebody would take it from you, steal it so you couldn't vote. So there's all kinds of shenanigans that they were pulling to keep people from being able to vote. Let's see, last not least is the grandfather clause. I always save that one for last. Because honestly, the first three that I've talked about so far, you know, race really isn't a component in that. It's more about being poor. You don't own land because you're poor. You can't read or write. You can't pass a literacy test. You haven't had an education. You can't pay your poll tax. So, like, Southern state governments were so dead set on taking away African American voting rights that it didn't bother them that they were in many ways also taking away Anglo-American voting rights or Hispanic voting rights. Like just being poor is what a lot of those Jim Crow laws were aimed at. But the grandfather clause is about race. There's no two ways you can get around it. The grandfather clause essentially stated that you had to prove that either you, your father, or your grandfather had voted in the 1860 election. And if you could prove that you, your father, or grandfather had voted in 1860, then you could vote. The problem with 1860 is slavery at that point was very much alive. Most African Americans did not have any rights, much less the right to vote. So, yeah, the grandfather clause is 100% about race and having to prove that you, your father, or your grandfather had voted back in 1860. Well, you put it together, and that is the various methods and means of disfranchisement that were used to keep people from voting. Again, it really was more about being poor on a lot of those disfranchisement efforts. But I'm not naive. The goal of these Jim Crow laws was to hurt African Americans who were trying to exercise their civil rights, their basic rights of being able to vote. And again, they did not technically deny you the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. They were denying you the right to vote based on property, literacy, poll tax, and grandfather clause. Okay, well, the second part of Jim Crow is segregation. That brings us to this big case of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. This is a huge case in the history of the Supreme Court, not known as a good decision handed down by the court, but it is a huge part of American history in a very bad way, the decision in Plessy v. Ferguson. Okay, the gentleman that you can see here on the PowerPoint, his name is Homer Plessy. He lived in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, and Homer Plessy was 1/8 African American. People who knew Homer Plessy said he just simply looked like a white guy. But in his family history, his ancestry, he was 1/8 African American. In today's world, that wouldn't matter even a little bit, but in that world, it mattered a lot. He was of mixed race ancestry, if you will. So that technically, when he went to ride the streetcars in the city of New Orleans, they were segregated based on race. And technically, under law, he was supposed to sit in what was called, quote, the colored section of the streetcars. There was a whites only section, and then there was a, quote, coloreds only section. But, you know, Homer Plessy feels that that city ordinance that segregates the streetcars, it's ridiculous. The law shouldn't be. So this is what we call a test case. A test case is where you mean to get arrested. You mean to challenge the law. So Homer Plessy got on the streetcar. The conductor came around to check tickets. Homer Plessy, while the conductor's checking his tickets, just, gives the information. Hey, actually, I'm 1/8 African American. Gets into a conversation with the conductor, and the conductor says, well, sir, if what you're telling me is true, I'm going to need you to stand up and come with me to the back of the streetcar. Homer Plessy refuses to do that. So, again, he meant for this to happen. He meant to cause this scene. And he is ticketed. He is arrested. He's processed by the city of New Orleans through its jail for violating that city ordinance that segregated the streetcars based on race. At that point, he lawyered up. This is exactly what he meant to do. He wanted to fight this in court. He lawyers up and he challenges his being arrested. And he loses his case. The courts in the city of New Orleans find that the city had every right to segregate its cars based on race. Then that was challenged to what's called the parish level. Most of the United States, we have counties. Louisiana is a little bit different. It's got quite a French heritage, so it's parishes in Louisiana. So he challenged it at the city level, at the parish level. Then he challenged that decision at the federal court level. And it made its way all the way up to the highest law in the land. It'll go before the United States Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court gets to pick what cases it listens to. You can't just appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court and it's an automatic. They decide yes or no if they'll hear your case. But the Supreme Court saw, the big magnitude of what was going on here. the concept of segregation and things like that. So the Supreme Court does agree to hear this case where Plessy is taking on that city ordinance there in New Orleans. And when the court hands down its decision, um, it's a big decision. There's no doubt about it. This is going to transform things. But the United States Supreme Court will argue that the city of New Orleans does, in fact, have the right to segregate its cars based on race. But there's a caveat to the decision. Supreme Court says, yes, you can separate based on race, but you must provide equal accommodations. And what comes out of that is a separate but equal society. You can separate based on race, but you must provide equal accommodations. That works like this. If you're going to have the streetcars in New Orleans separated based on race, a whites only section and a quote coloreds only section. If you have a restroom in the whites only section, you have to have a restroom in the quote colored section as well. If you are going to serve coffee in one part of the the streetcar, you have to serve coffee in the other part of the streetcar as well. So you can separate, but you have to have equal accommodations in both areas. Well, white America embraced the separate part and just about flat out ignored the equal part. What you have going forward is the segregation of America and that separate but equal society that will emerge. Let's see, schools will be separated based on race. You'd have whites only schools and quote colored only schools. The white side of town, the white schools, new buildings, certified teachers, new textbooks, new equipment. The quote colored schools, they tended to have teachers that weren't certified to be teaching those subjects. They usually got the hand-me-down textbooks and the hand-me-down equipment from the whites only schools, and it just really wasn't equal accommodations at the end of the day. Restaurants would be segregated. A lot of places where you could grab something to eat, they would let the white customer sit inside the restaurant. But then if an African American person came up to order food, they would be told to go around to the back where they would take their order, cook it, and then hand it to them in a bag where they could go eat it somewhere else. So that's what separate but equal meant. You also had like drinking fountains. You'd have a drinking fountain for whites only, then a drinking fountain for, quote, coloreds only. So it's really ridiculous the way the separate but equal society emerged. Here you can see this laundromat. We wash for white people only. You got to go to the restroom, right? You see this top right-hand thing. You got to go. You're trying to find the men's room. It's not enough to find the men's room. Now you got to figure out, is this for white men or, quote, colored men before you can go take a restroom break. So yeah, this is this weird, crazy society that emerges in the face of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, so once Jim Crow becomes federal law, it starts to take over the entire country. It's not just done in the South, it'll be done in the North as well, and even on out to the West. But what I want to do now is I want to start looking at how individuals reacted to Jim Crow. We'll start by looking at Booker T. Washington and his response, and we'll look at others as well. But in looking at Booker T. Washington, this is a man who, as a very young child, technically he was born in Virginia, but where he was raised would later become West Virginia during the Civil War. But he was born into slavery. And he said that one of the tasks that he had to do as a young man, as a young slave, was he was forced to walk with his master's kids as they went to school. He said that he had to make sure that they actually went into the building, and then he was to run back to the plantation to do work or whatever. I guess the master's kids were skipping school or something. I'm not sure. But Booker T. Washington said he had to walk those kids to school, make sure they went into the building, and then he said he couldn't help but stick around and sort of peek through the windows or listen in by the door. And as he put it, he was sort of stealing education because he was so curious. He just didn't understand like what was going on in there. Why was it so important that he had to walk those kids to the building? And so that in that way, he was kind of, I don't know, fascinated by education, fascinated by the process of learning. Fast forward the story, he grows up, emancipation comes, the Civil War ends, and as he put it, his mind was a sponge and he just couldn't learn enough. He was getting an education, he would go on to get degrees, certifications, and it would eventually lead him to open up what he called the Tuskegee Institute. He went into Alabama to provide educational opportunities for African Americans in the Deep South. And in opening up the Tuskegee Institute, what he saw was vocational training was the key to everything. Like not just education, but an education that's focused on getting a job, if you will. And that's what Tuskegee was about. It was about teaching young African American men how to work with industrial equipment, machinery, things like that. Young women who attended Tuskegee would learn typing skills, clerical skills, and things like that. So, this wasn't just like a sort of a classical education where you're reading Shakespeare. They were getting an education, but it was more of a focus on getting jobs. Booker T. Washington really believed that equality would come through economic opportunity. And that's what Tuskegee was about, was trying to provide an avenue for economic opportunity for African Americans. Along the way, he's also seen as what we call an accommodationist. That is to say that he was in ways accepting of Jim Crow. Honestly, privately, he hated Jim Crow. He referred to it as what he called a temporary evil. He really hoped that at some point equality would be achieved and that white America would sort of give up on that segregation, the separate but equal society. But I don't know. You look at it, and he was accommodating in ways to segregation, to Jim Crow. In what's known as the Atlanta Compromise speech of 1895, he spoke at an exhibit there in Atlanta, and it really stunned the crowd when he spoke that an African American man was talking to a crowd of mostly white people there at the fair, the exhibition. But in the Atlanta Compromise speech, he essentially said that separate but equal society. He hoped America could live up to the equal part. He more or less accepted the fact that Jim Crow was a reality, and that African Americans through work could achieve equality someday. White America really liked what he had to say in Atlanta. White America really saw him as sort of the leader of African Americans. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner in the early 1900s. And it's crazy, man, the public backlash that Roosevelt got for that. The newspapers just really tore him apart for allowing an African American man to sit at the dinner table at the White House. Okay, so that's one response to Jim Crow as accommodation, accepting of it. The Tuskegee Institute, Booker T. Washington, and accommodation is one response to Jim Crow. Looking here at letter E, for most African Americans, the response was very negative. They didn't care for Jim Crow. They didn't like it at all. For a lot of African Americans, they were still facing farm labor exploitation in the Deep South that we talked about before, sharecropping and things like that. As the situation got worse, you started to see this migration of African Americans moving to northern cities, especially in the 1910s, and especially during World War I in 1917. You really started to see a lot of African Americans leaving the South, looking for work in factories up north. There was a war on. We needed to produce the weapons that would be needed to win the war. So African Americans tended to migrate to northern cities looking for factory work, again, especially during World War I. And those who got out of the South came to the North. What we say is they eventually would form a middle class, an African American middle class of sorts. And they would raise their kids to fight against Jim Crow and to fight against segregation and racism. And really, it's their children, the children of that middle class that emerged. They're the ones that go on to beat Jim Crow, to give it, to fight it in the courts and eventually unravel the whole concept of segregation later on down the road. Here's a photograph from Tuskegee. You can see these guys working with drill presses and factory equipment as they're getting a vocational education there. Okay, well, another response to Jim Crow comes through the NAACP. This stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But honestly, NAACP is fine for your notes. If you should have to write it on a test, NAACP is fine. But the NAACP, which is going to be founded in New York City, was actually founded by businessmen in New York who really felt like segregation and what was happening with segregation was hurting their workforce, sort of hurting their ability to get trained and educated workers in New York factories. So this is a group of businessmen in New York who formed this organization. And what the NAACP will fight for is the assertion of civil rights. So whereas Booker T. Washington is seen as accepting of Jim Crow, the NAACP does not accept Jim Crow. It's fighting against it and its assertion for your rights as an American citizen. The man who really goes on to lead the NAACP is the gentleman in the photograph here. This is a Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois was a Harvard-educated African-American man. In fact, he's the first African-American man to receive a PhD from Harvard University. Dr. Du Bois grew up in and around the Boston area, so he didn't face that sort of Southern style of racism that was very violent, very physical. But Dr. Du Bois, in getting his degree from Harvard, he had a hard time finding a job at some of the more elite schools in the country. His colleagues that he graduated with, who tended to be white, they had no problems getting hired on at places like Yale, Columbia. But first-tier schools were not letting him in. Second-tier schools, he was having a problem getting in on there as well. And at some point, he began to realize that it was the color of his skin that was keeping him from getting those jobs. I mean, if you got a degree from Harvard, especially back then, say 1890s America, you could pretty much pick where you wanted to work, truth be told. So he felt that sting of racism in his own life. And his response was, like if that's happening to me, a very educated man living in the North, what must be happening to those poor farmers down in, say, Alabama? What kind of racism must they be facing in their lives? So Dr. Du Bois basically dedicated his life to fighting for racial equality, to fighting for civil rights. He never gave up that fight to his dying day. And he's the guy who's going to lead that charge of the NAACP, who's out there fighting for African American civil rights. So far we have one response is Booker T. Washington, who's an accommodationist. Now we have Dr. Du Bois and the NAACP, who are fighting for civil rights, fighting against Jim Crow. Well, last but not least, we have Marcus Garvey, the gentleman who's pictured here. We'll look at him just a second. I forgot I have to explain black nationalism and how that leads to the rise of something called the UNIA. So black nationalism is something that comes in the aftermath of World War I. I know we haven't talked about World War I yet, but I promise you we will. But there were a lot of African American men who volunteered to fight in World War I. They signed up for service. They were trained here in the United States. They were shipped across the ocean to Europe. And they found when they got into the Western Front in Europe and France that they were treated as second-class citizens and soldiers. Rather than be used in combat, a lot of African American soldiers were used as cooks, as cleaners, as guys who worked with the quartermasters with supplies and things like that. And they found that they just simply weren't going to be trusted in combat by the United States government. It's some really ridiculous stuff. But the U.S. military just said that it didn't trust these soldiers in combat, felt that they would, drop their guns and run away in horror because they weren't truly men. That's a ridiculous statement. All they had to do was look back at the Civil War, look back at the the service that African American men had given during the Civil War, winning medals and accommodations and proving themselves the equals of a white soldier in combat. It was a really ridiculous statement by the U.S. military. Uh, but towards the end of the conflict, the United States government would let segregated units serve in combat, but at first that wasn't the case. Well, France, in those moments, 1917, 1918, they needed men. They were low on manpower. They needed men to get out there with machine guns and fight the Germans. So the French basically contact the U.S. government and say, hey, look, if you're not going to use these men, we would love to. And this was a voluntary thing. Nobody's forced to do this, but African American men were given the opportunity to volunteer to serve under the French flag. Many of them did. So you got a lot of these guys who they're there to fight for democracy. They're not really getting democracy back home, but they're willing to fight for it on the battlefields of Europe. So under the French command, you have a lot of African American men who serve. They serve valiantly. They prove themselves the equals of white soldiers in combat. They win medals and accommodations. You even have some African American soldiers winning what's called the Croix de Guerre, which is French for the Cross of War. And that's like the highest military honor that the French can give a soldier, is the Croix de Guerre. We have the Medal of Honor. They have the Croix de Guerre. So these African American men were treated as human beings under the French command, treated as equals, given honors, accommodations, and medals. And when World War I comes to an end, a lot of those African American soldiers said, you know what, I'm good. I think I'm going to stay here in France, where they treat me like a man. So a lot of those guys did stay over there in Europe after the war. But for most of those African American World War I vets, they got a wife and kids back home. They got family they want to go back to. You can completely understand that. So they come back home to the United States, but in coming back home, they're really changed. They feel a sense of equality. Hey, I went over there and risked my life for democracy. And now that I'm home, I want to enjoy the fruits of freedom and democracy. I want to vote. I'm tired of Jim Crow, and I feel like I've earned the right to vote. I mean, like if you serve in combat, the least we can do is give you the right to vote. That's where it starts, and we should just start adding things on from there for real. And these men, they just have the audacity to come home to the United States and say, I'm a man, I'm equal, and I want to enjoy my rights. But what happened was an extreme backlash by white America against those African American veterans of World War I. The summer of 1919 in the United States was a horrible summer in terms of racial relations. There were riots, there were murders, there were lynchings, and a lot of it came down to those veterans of the war coming home demanding the right to vote, demanding their basic civil rights, and being just beaten, shot, hanged, lynched. And I always get so upset when I talk about this. Like, those guys faced the hell that was no man's land over there in Europe, and I promise you, it was hell. It was a meat grinder, and those guys endured all that, and they survived all that, only to come home and be shot by ignorant racists in America who didn't want them to have the right to vote. So yeah, these guys stood up for their civil rights. They were beaten, harassed, shot, murdered for having the audacity to do that. So in the aftermath of that summer of 1919, a lot of African Americans said, you know what, to heck with white society. It really is time to separate. And you started to see the rise of what were called separated societies popping up in the United States. Self-help communities began to pop up. A separated society worked like this. So you live in an African American community. Harlem in New York, for example, was a self-help community, a separated society. You don't have anything to do with white America. If you need to buy groceries, you go to a store that's owned by African Americans. If you get sick and you need to go to the doctor, you go to an African American doctor. But you keep the money in-house. So, Plessy v. Ferguson says separate but equal. So separated society is, okay, fine, we'll separate. We'll see how you like it when you don't have our money. We're not helping your economy. So separated societies were about keeping everything in-house within the African American community and relying on each other, self-help communities. So against that backdrop, you start to see the rise of this organization called the UNIA. It's short for the Universal Negro Improvement Association. UNIA, though, is fine for your notes and if you should write it on a test. But this organization is founded by this gentleman here named Marcus Garvey that you see. Marcus Garvey was born and raised in Jamaica, which is predominantly people of African descent. But Marcus Garvey, growing up in Jamaica, really didn't face racism. The color of his skin wasn't used against him or anything like that. But in 1917, as the United States is gearing up for World War I, he comes to the United States on a work visa. We need people in factories making the weapons of war, just contributing to the economy in various ways. So Garvey arrives in New Orleans, Louisiana on a work visa from Jamaica. And whilst he's in New Orleans loading and unloading ships in the docks, he faces all manner of racism and persecution. He finds that people are very rude to him because of the color of his skin, belittling him, cussing at him, things like that. He starts to wonder, hey, is this truly the land of the free that I'm living in here? And he starts to start to look into, well, okay, is this just New Orleans that's like this? And comes to realize that no, actually, it's the country at large. The United States itself has a race problem at that time. But then in his sort of pondering on this and looking into this racism, this treatment of peoples of African descent, he finds that it's not just in the United States, it's actually on a planetary scale, that it's even being done in Africa itself, in South Africa, by the British. So the UNIA, really it's an organization that's supposed to encompass the entirety of the planet. Coming out of Africa, a Pan-African movement, as he called it. What the UNIA argued for was African Americans standing up for themselves and helping each other. It stressed pride as a people, pride in race, and the universal, like worldwide, Universal Negro Improvement Association really was about helping African Americans or people of African descent, period, around the world. He very much believed in the self-help ideology. The UNIA argued for separated societies. So here's a third approach to Jim Crow. The UNIA and Marcus Garvey arguing for self-help and separated societies. Within that, he and Dr. Du Bois did not get along. It's really sad. He wrote some really nasty letters to Dr. Du Bois, saying things like, the U.S. government's never going to give you what you want. You're never going to get that equality, those civil rights that you're arguing for. And honestly, at that moment in time, I would even argue in the early 1920s, most African Americans agreed with Garvey, not so much the NAACP. But the fight between the two organizations was basically Dr. Du Bois argued for cooperation with white society, working within the system through the legal system to get civil rights. Whereas Garvey wants nothing to do with white society, is the antithesis of cooperation, is arguing for self-help. And again, more African Americans were members of the UNIA than they were the NAACP in the very late 1910s and on into the early 1920s. But then in 1924, a big moment happens where Garvey is arrested. Some really ticky-tack stuff. He was arrested for mail fraud. There's a huge backstory there. I'll explain it as quick as I can. So when the UNIA would try to do some fundraising, it would send out these brochures saying that you could pay for a cruise, you could go on a cruise. Some of the proceeds would go to the UNIA. It was, I don't know, one of the things they did to try to get funding. So, okay, they sent out these brochures with the picture of a ship on the front of the brochure. But then the ship that people actually went on was not the ship that was in the brochure. It's just a picture of a ship. But technically it was considered mail fraud. It was misleading, making it look like people were going to go on this one ship for a cruise, but they show up and it's a completely different ship. So, okay, the man's committed mail fraud, so like, let's give him a fine. Let's a slap on the wrist. Let's change those pamphlets. But no, the U.S. government threw the book at this guy for mail fraud. Actually, what they're doing is they're going after him because he's a black man and he's an organizer, and he's giving people a sense of pride in their race. But the U.S. government, through the federal courts, is going to throw the book at him. He's going to get 7 years in a federal prison for committing mail fraud. So be careful. Don't be going out there committing mail fraud, right? You might get 7 years in a federal pen. It's just ridiculous what they did to the man. He got out after almost 4 years on good behavior. He was released. But upon his release, he was removed from the country. He was deported. He had been in the country on a work visa, but then once he's arrested, he serves his time. Then once he's released from jail, he's deported, forced to travel back to Jamaica. At that point, he could go anywhere he wanted, just couldn't go to the United States. And with Garvey's deportation, with his removal from the United States, the UNIA really began to fall apart, within our country anyway. It started to fall apart at that point. It just didn't have that zeal, that backing that he had given it. So it begins to fall apart here in the U.S. And what we say is the NAACP was still there. It prevailed. It became the organization that African Americans would work through to fight Jim Crow and fight for change. And the NAACP was the organization that just kept that torch going, that fight against Jim Crow and against racial segregation and disfranchisement. For the NAACP, the fight really was more about court cases, lawyers, judges, things like that, getting a case in front of the courts. And eventually their biggest success will come later on down the road in Brown v. Board of Education. We'll talk about that when we get past World War II. We start looking at the latter part of the 20th century. But what we argue is, or what we say is, the NAACP kept the civil rights movement alive. It really is the foundation of the civil rights movement to come. And yeah, it's just going to carry that torch forward for change. All right, well, that's it for this topic. Thank you and have a good day.